I wanted to comment on the interview that Tony Khan gave to Jonathan Coachman and Vince Russo this week on their Coach and Bro show. I thought Tony handled himself very well. He's clearly been either media trained or decided to train himself to be more disciplined with this stuff and not take the bait on certain things, right? Turn the other cheek, kill him with kindness. Russo made a valid point. And yes, I actually just spoke those words out loud. He made a valid point when he told Tony, you've got this huge opportunity right now with all the fans that are feeling disenfranchised with the WWE product, or maybe they're feeling priced out by TKO. And you have a real opportunity here to bring those fans into the fold in AEW. And he's absolutely right. I would be hammering home that affordability point nonstop if I were AEW. Not that your product is cheaper, right? You never want to use the word cheap to describe your product or your ticket prices, even if they are. You use the word affordable. And affordability is a big issue right now for a lot of people. And the cost of an AEW ticket is just objectively more affordable than a WWE ticket right now. And then hammer home that one of AEW's strong suits is its focus on wrestling. Sometimes there's too much wrestling in any given night. But if that's what you're looking for, you're going to get more bang for your buck at an AEW show than you will generally at a WWE show. These are things that I have heard Kenny Omega talking about it recently, but they should have every one of their top talents that is out there. And I think MJF also has talked about it, but they should have every one of their top talents out there that are doing media for Dynasty talking about this stuff. But Russo's point was also, step on their neck, go for the jugular. And Tony's response was, he doesn't need to be that cutthroat, basically, but he does see that there is an opportunity there. And even people who told him, not to come on their show. He told Russo, like you, Vince, I'm a Christian, and I'm not going to hold negative things that people said about me in the past or about AEW in the past against them for the rest of their lives. That's not what Jesus would do. And maybe he truly believes that, or maybe he just had a really savvy way of answering that question, because I'm sure he does hold things against certain people that have said negative things about AEW. But it was a really smart answer. But now is a great time for him to try to lure some of those fans over. Like, hey, look, we've got a big tent over here. There's plenty of room for everyone. I don't think the interview was radically different from others that he has done. He did give them over an hour. They did ask some questions that he has not been asked before, or people just have recently not had a chance to sit down and ask him. He addressed Chris Jericho's return to AEW, saying, I do know that Chris had a choice and he wanted to be in AEW. He would be the best person to ask, but I know that I've been in communication with Chris, and he definitely told me that he wanted to be at AEW, and very specifically in Winnipeg on that date. We've had that circled for a long time going back to last year. And it was a choice that Chris made that he would rather be in AEW than wrestling anywhere else. And I think that's awesome. So I can't say for sure exactly what his mindset was, but I know that he definitely always has been consistent that he loves AEW and he wants to be here. And I'm glad that he chose to be in AEW, because that is a choice that he made because he was a free agent. He didn't speak to any time that he may have tacked on to Jericho's deal, and he specifically mentioned that Jericho was a free agent. Right? That was the language that he used. Now, obviously, his contract never officially expired, because if it had, they usually, they pulled people from their roster page, and they never did that with Jericho. Jericho was on there consistently for the entire year that he was out. But that's what he said here. And also, he said that they had Winnipeg, right? That date in Winnipeg for Dynamite last week circled dating back to last year. So my guess is that, Jericho sent out feelers, either directly or indirectly to WWE. He may have had conversations with them directly. And I think WWE wanted him for a retirement run. That's what I think they wanted him for. And I don't think Jericho was interested in that. But also, he would not have had the kind of freedom to do outside things with WWE the way that he does now with AEW. So outside of getting that nostalgia pop from the WWE audience and having all new faces to work with, if you're Jericho, it just made more sense to stay put. And he probably got himself a much better deal out of it. So I'm sure that was all part of his plan too, right? To drive up his value with all this talk that, hey, he might go back to WWE. And Tony Khan really wanted to keep him and said, hey, basically, what's it going to take to keep you here in AEW? And he was asked about their reliance on hardcore matches and violence on AEW shows, like all the blood and syringes through the cheek, that sort of thing. and how that might turn off newer fans checking out the product for the first time. Tony said that there are some hardcore things that he thinks would not be a good idea, and he will say no to. Now think of all the shit that we see on these shows that he doesn't say no to. The stuff that he does say no to, what must those ideas look like? But he said there are some things that he first runs by the network, right? If there's going to be something hardcore being done on TBS or TNT. But a lot of what Coach was describing happened on the pay-per-view, which is what Tony said. Like what you're talking about, that took place on a pay-per-view, talking about the Texas death match between MJF and Hangman. And that's a fair point, but, they did do 2 blood and guts matches on television last year, one for the men and one for the women. And they have blood, on almost every single show, every single week. We've seen the thumbtacks and the staple guns and the barbed wire. We've seen that on television plenty of times, so it's not just on pay-per-view. Russo brought up Brawl Out and the scrum with CM Punk and how bad he felt for Tony looking at him squirming around up there. And he asked him if he learned anything from that experience. And Tony said that he did, but he never really elaborated on what those things were that he learned, other than to say that there are things he would have done and said differently. And I will always say that whole situation could have been avoided if he would have stepped in months earlier when rumors first started circulating about CM Punk getting Colt Cabana banished from AEW television. He got him banished to Ring of Honor. And if that wasn't true, then Tony should have addressed it, because it was allowed to fester. And clearly it annoyed Punk, who said, I had nothing to do with any of this shit. And I can believe that CM Punk at no point went to Tony Khan and said, hey, you got to get rid of this guy. But what I can believe is that Tony Khan decided, you know what, I know there's no love lost here between these two. And Punk's my guy. He's my top guy. He's my champion, right? Or he became champion later on. But to avoid any potential conflicts here, we're going to shift Colt Cabana over here, or we're not going to use him on the show right now. I could absolutely believe that it was something that Tony Khan went and did on his own, and it annoyed the fuck out of CM Punk because the narrative became that Punk got Colt Cabana iced, or he got him fired, or whatever. So to me, it goes all the way back to that. Or you can look at the workers' rights promo, right? The Hangman Page promo on CM Punk before their match at Double or Nothing, which obviously touched a nerve with Punk. And I think Tony should have stepped in, gotten the two of them in a room. I don't think he realized just how serious a situation that was. I don't know that anybody did. But he could have put the flames out a lot earlier, and he didn't. And it turned into this uncontrollable blaze that almost burned down the entire company. Now, they asked him about his famous meeting with Shane McMahon at the airport in 2024. He said, I had one really pleasant conversation with Shane. Shane reached out to me and said, I'd love to get together. Where are you going to be? I was going to be in Dallas. I said, I can meet you here. We had a nice conversation. We talked for a few hours at the airport. I thought it was really strange that a photo came out from it. I thought it was pretty unusual. It could just be that somebody who worked at the airport, but I know I had nothing to do with it. It's very unusual. I talk to people all the time from all different media places. Shane is a very recognizable face in sports, in the world of wrestling. That could be what it is. Somebody recognized that we were in a room and wanted to take a photo. I'm in a lot of rooms with a lot of people, and I've only ever had that happen to me one time. I thought that was pretty unusual. You can see in the photo, I'm very surprised. I noticed that he wasn't as surprised in the photo. I've only had one really nice talk with him. I also thought it was quite impressive that in one conversation, it somehow got out that I had talked to him. It was a pleasant chat, and he seemed like a really interesting guy. I don't think the role of being an on-screen person on a wrestling show seemed like something he was particularly interested in, but he had a lot of interesting things and experiences that are totally different than mine. I don't think he went into it thinking, I want to be a character on this guy's show. He really went out of his way to let us know that he had nothing to do with that photo leaking, but boy, it was sure strange that Shane didn't seem all that surprised by the photo. If you don't even have to read between the lines, he's saying it without saying it. You know what he was getting at there? And I think he's probably right. I think Shane wanted back in WWE. And he called the meeting to make sure that it would get out. He was never going to AEW. He never wanted to go to AEW. And maybe he felt like he could actually learn something from the conversation, like inside information or something. But I think he wanted word to get out and that it would put pressure on WWE to reach out to him about bringing him back. And it didn't work. And I'm glad he didn't end up as an on-screen character in AEW, because the last thing AEW needed or needs is a fucking McMahon on TV. But I also loved all these fans at the time who were like, yeah, but Shane is just the creative force that TK needs behind the scenes, right? When there is absolutely no evidence of Shane McMahon being any sort of creative mastermind. I still don't know where or how that narrative got started. Like, he may be a creative genius and we just don't know it. But some people were talking about it like this is exactly what Tony Khan needs. And I'm like, based on what? What evidence do you have to base this on? Raw Underground? Like, it never made any sense to me. They asked him about the Brandon Thurston report from last week about him bidding on WWE back in 2023. And it was funny, listening to Coach talk about how, nobody else has asked him about this. Yes, because the report just came out. He hadn't done any interviews, to my knowledge, since the news came out. Okay, calm down. But he admitted that he did indeed make a bid for $6.9 billion, which he said was market value for WWE at that time. And he said, like, if the company had sold for any less than that, if they sold for like $6.5 billion, he would have been kicking himself for not trying. And he understood, why they wouldn't grant him access to the room that the other bidders were allowed to go into, so they could go through additional like financial records, confidential records for WWE. He understood why they didn't want him in that room. But it's just one of those things where, like, man, if I didn't make that bid and the company sold for less than that, I'd be kicking myself, I mean, he had nothing to lose. He was never going to get it, but he had nothing to lose, by making a bid. But maybe the biggest takeaway from the entire interview was them asking him, and Russo asked him, what's in the cup? Everywhere this man goes, every interview, every podcast, every scrum, he's got that fucking cup in his hand. It's like his emotional support cup. And he said it's black coffee. That was the biggest development to come out of this entire thing. Now we know what is inside the cup.